Hey, everybody. Welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to another episode in our Season 2 finale series where we're recapping major genre groups from the 1990s. In today's episode, we're going to be recapping girl groups and boy bands of the 90s, which is very exciting because we didn't talk about them basically at all in the entirety of Season 2. So, just as a reminder, this is, as I said a moment ago, a series of episodes. So, there are other episodes that are out there as part of this recap series. So, feel free to check those out as well. Additionally, if you're interested in listening to any of the music that I highlight in today's episode, you can check out the essential playlist that I've linked in the description of this episode here. As well, that if you're looking for my big list in which I have gathered up all of the songs from the 1990s that I perceive to be meaningful or impactful, that will be dropping at the end of this entire series. So look out for that when it drops. So, what are we going to talk about today? So, as usual for this series, we are going to be reviewing what we discussed in the 1980s about girl groups and boy bands, which wasn't very much, so it'll go really fast. Next, we're going to overview the subgenres which we'll be hitting today, which should be obvious because it's just girl groups and boy bands. And then finally, we're going to dive into each of those two subgenres with milestone songs for each and why. So let's talk about what we discussed in the 1980s recap for girl groups and boy bands. Basically nothing. So throughout the entirety of the 1980s, we might have mentioned groups like New Kids on the Block, New Edition, or maybe Menudo for about a second. But the reality is that none of that music was necessarily bubbling up in a meaningful way, and girl groups and boy bands weren't so much happening in the 80s. I think that essentially what was happening in the 1980s was that you had the Jackson 5 and then the Jacksons, a boy band in and of itself, that was happening in the 70s and carried over a little bit into the 1980s. And then it was kind of quiet for a minute as Michael Jackson broke away from the Jacksons and did his own thing. But record companies and producers were looking for an opportunity to capture value on this void that was left by the Jacksons no longer being a thing. And so, for example, bands like New Edition were created that had Bobby Brown in it, or Menudo, for example, that had Ricky Martin in it, or New Kids on the Block that had Donnie Wahlberg in it, that inevitably created Mark Wahlberg / Marky Mark and just that whole thing. So there was a lot that was going on in the 80s that was below the threshold of quality that we were willing to discuss, but there were some things that were happening in the 80s that were very early proto versions of the massive wave that would be girl groups and boy bands in the 1990s. So now that we've talked a little bit about the 1980s recap, let's talk a little bit more about what was happening going into the 1990s in the world of girl groups and boy bands. So at the very beginning of the decade, there was a movement which we discussed a little bit in season 2 in the early episodes around New Jack Swing, which was a offshoot variety of R&B music / group R&B music, if you want to think about it that way. And it had its own flavor, its own vibe to it. It got referenced in multiple different capacities. When we highlighted Tony for that one album during season 2, we talked about New Jack Swing a little bit. So New Jack Swing was a mini movement within the R&B scene that you will hear as you're going along, at least for the first couple tracks for either girl groups or boy bands, that you hear a little bit of this New Jack Swing idea, and then eventually it will work its way out. So now that we've just talked about New Jack Swing a little bit, let's start then by talking about girl groups. So in the 1980s, girl groups were approximately a thing that was happening. I think that girl groups took approximately two major buckets of varieties. One was in the R&B scene, so think about the Pointer Sisters, and then also in the pop scene that was trying to take a bunch of Madonna knockoffs, sorry, Michelle Visage, and turn them into a girl group. So that was basically, so talking about Michelle Visage for a second, her group Obsession was approximately trying to take a bunch of Madonnas and put them together and turn them into a group. So there was a lot of that was happening in the mid-late 80s. So that was the more pop side of things. And then on the R&B side of things, like I said, it was more traditional girl groups that were carry forwards from, let's say, Motown that had a bunch of girl groups. And that tradition just continued forward. In the 80s, we called out the Pointer Sisters as a great example and just kept moving forward. So by the time we get to our first track that we're going to call out, which is in 1992, SWV came out with I'm So Into You on their album It's About Time. So remember a second ago when I talked about how there was really two major kinds of girl groups that were happening in the 1980s. One that was more traditional R&B girl group styles a la the Pointer Sisters. And then towards the latter half of the 80s, there was a bunch of girl groups that were taking a bunch of Madonnas and putting them together. That's what this sounds like. This is much more of that styling. So we're definitely calibrated correctly in 1992 with this track. The interesting thing to call out here is if you listen to the Western pop music episode as part of this series, talking about Kathy Dennis on her track Touch Me in 1990, I talked about how it sounded like Madonna, particularly Express Yourself, which came out in the late 80s. Interestingly enough, if you listen to I'm So Into You by SWV, also sounds like Kathy Dennis in Touch Me, which was at this point 2 years prior. But that's how you can get that calibration of it sounds like a bunch of Madonnas put together, because Madonna is the common factor between Kathy Dennis and SWV in this case. So it's a good grounding for you to understand where we're starting the 90s out, and also a good example to elicit the point of what I said about how the end of the 80s was about creating Madonna groups. So here we are. So next, just a couple years later, we get Waterfalls by TLC on Crazy Sexy Cool in 1994. This obviously in no way sounds like Madonna or a group of Madonnas. It also doesn't sound like 80s style R&B a la the Pointer Sisters, even if it is a girl group. This very much sounds like it's at the very least fifth wave neo-solo R&B like Aaliyah. It might even be leaning in further than that to potentially a sixth wave, which does happen because in the 90s, I think we go through a fifth, sixth, and seventh wave of neo-solo R&B artists. So this is definitely forward-leaning. The subject is approximately the same. So it's talking about love. It's talking about relationships. It's a pretty common thing for girl groups and boy bands to be talking about relationships and love and troubles with love and troubles with relationships. Obviously, I'm So Into You is a little bit more hopeful than Waterfalls, because Waterfalls is a very depressing song about not being caught in situations in which you can't control them and you can't do anything about them. And so you just throw up your hands and say, you know what? This is too much for me. I need to bow out. Or at the very least, to not go too hard on yourself, because there's no reason to chase waterfalls, because you're never going to be able to put your arms entirely around a waterfall. It's too powerful. It's too strong. There's too much inertia behind it. There's too much momentum behind it. So you have to either sort of make that choice to be at peace with what you can do or move on. So I'm So Into You, it's more at the beginning of something versus Waterfalls, which is absolutely at the end of something. So it's an interesting dynamic. TLC is doing an excellent job in this case, taking the revolution that's happening with neo-solo R&B artistry in the 90s and infusing that into girl group dynamics. One of the other great things about this track is that it's starting to go in that direction of including more rap components to it. It's giving the members of the girl group a little bit more to do than just harmonies. You could think about En Vogue, for example, which we're not talking about here necessarily, but a great way to elicit the point on early 90s girl groups also. That's much more about harmonizing together and creating that melody in those harmonies. Waterfalls has a little bit more of a dynamic to it, like one person sings, one person raps, one person sings, they all come together, another person sings, and they jump off of each other. So it's much more dynamic, and in many ways is getting us closer to eventually in the 2000s when we start to think about K-pop girl groups. I'm So Into You is really, really early K-pop ideas. Waterfalls is, some might even argue, K-pop ideas that were happening probably right up until recently as of this recording. So the ideas that TLC is putting forward here with Waterfalls are very forward-leaning. They're extraordinarily influential. Obviously, Waterfalls is one of the most impactful, pivotal girl group songs of the entire decade, to include several other tracks on Crazy Sexy Cool. It's a very important album, very critical. So another great way to sort of elicit that point about us moving forward and evolving on girl groups in the 90s. So next, we're going to move into 1996 with Last Time Lover by the Spice Girls on their first album, Spice. So one might think that me calling out Last Time Lover is a little bit of a cherry pick, because this album is 95% hits, and all of them are pretty different than Last Time Lover. Last Time Lover is a fairly different idea than Wannabe or Two Become One, Say You'll Be There, all the other tracks that are just wildly famous and popular on this album and put Spice Girls on the map. But Last Time Lover is a really great way to articulate how we're continuing to evolve the overall girl group conception, where if Spice Girls was a little bit breaking the mold and trying to become less R&B and more widely commercial, which I think was sort of the point of the Spice Girls, is to create this semi-manufactured girl group moment, that Last Time Lover was one of the very rare tracks on the album that actually leaned into doing more traditional girl group ideas that fall better in line with Waterfalls or I'm So Into You, and less so just making straight ahead pop music like Wannabe. The reason that Last Time Lover is on here, other than the fact that not calling out Spice Girls in a conversation around girl groups of the 90s would be borderline criminal, is that it takes what Waterfalls was doing and it punches it up even more. So where Waterfalls punched up I'm So Into You even more, Last Time Lover takes it even further. Obviously, there's more people in the group, so there's more harmonies that they can do. They can trade off who's singing much more so than the 3 people in TLC. Now there's 5 of them, so they can trade off even more. There's a teeny tiny bit of rapping or pseudo singing rapping. It's got a sexiness to it, or it's got a depth to it. It's hard to describe, but so I'm So Into You seems to like float at the top, where the way that they're singing and the way that they're emoting in the song isn't necessarily giving you sexy. It's not giving you that connective tissue, that connective feeling that one might feel when you're listening to a sultry singer or a sexy singer, that it's drawing you to them. Waterfalls a little bit has that, but it's a little bit on accident. And even though the album is called Crazy Sexy Cool, I wouldn't say that in Waterfalls they're doing anything inherently that's connecting you to them necessarily, but it's connecting you to the story that's happening, because the story is obviously the most important part of Waterfalls. The music is really great, but what they're trying to express to the listener is undoubtedly what's most important about the song. Last Time Lover, certainly not nearly as much, because much like almost all the songs on Spice, with the exception of maybe Mama, it's all about how sexy they are, how they want to connect with potential lovers, the relationships that they may or may not be in that moment, everything around that. So it's very much about relationships, and Last Time Lover in this case is obviously about talking about how they want to be each other's last time lover. To say that there will be no lovers after this because I will be the last you will ever have, or even the last you will ever have to this depth and degree. So there is obviously a sexiness to it, a certain degree of spice, some might say. So in 1996, as a result, I wouldn't say that they're staying in sync with, let's just say, seventh wave neo solo R&B, because I don't think they are necessarily, because I do think that so much of this is just leaning into pop music, but it still is inching the conversation forward about what girl groups can be and should be, and how you can continue to up the complexity and up the dynamic. Whereas if Waterfalls was so much about the story and about the message, and it was a little bit about the skill and the capability of the girl group and how well you were able to connect with them, Last Time Lover goes even further in that. The story is balanced out a little bit, so it can be about more than just the story. There's a little bit of singing, there's a little bit of harmony, there's a little bit of sexiness, there's a little bit of I want to connect with you, you connect with me sort of thing, and become more of a fan of the group. So it's just more evened out, more balanced out, which is why it's an evolution. And then finally, in 1999, we have Bills, Bills, Bills by Destiny's Child on The Writings on the Wall. So again, it would be kind of strange if we didn't talk about girl groups in the 90s and not talk about Destiny's Child and Beyonce. So in 1999 with Bills, 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 this was very much later waves in the 90s of the neo solo R&B ideas. This was produced by Timbaland, obviously, because it's got his brand all over it, which sometimes that's what you have to do. I mean, this is bordering on Empire rap as a result, because it's in the Timbaland consortium, and Destiny's Child is just integrating with his empire that he's pulling together. And Bills, Bills, Bills feels like we are absolutely blasting off into the 2000s, because shortly after this, Beyonce is going to start doing her own thing. After another little bit of time with Destiny's Child all being together, then Beyonce is going to go off and do her thing and be a solo artist. And we all kind of know where that goes. And we'll talk about that obviously in the next season. So it's just a really great way to capstone girl groups, from beginning with SWV, I'm So Into You, and then going and listening to Bills, Bills, Bills by Destiny's Child. They sound very different from one another. The R&B elements of Destiny's Child sound so much more so than SWV, or at the very least, they are living out the 90s R&B ideas so much more fully than whatever was getting played with in pseudo New Jack Swing, pseudo Madonna group ideas in 1992 with I'm So Into You. So the evolution is very clear, very obvious. But I would say in the overall arc, it was always pretty much staying within being true to R&B conventions. So even with I'm So Into You, we didn't lean so far out of R&B that you couldn't construe this as being R&B music. It does have those Madonna, Kathy Dennis-esque ideas, but it's still at its core R&B. And so the interesting thing about girl groups, juxtaposed to what we're going to talk about here in a second with boy bands, is that it almost invariably stayed true to its R&B roots all the way through the 90s, at least from a quality perspective. I am absolutely certain that there were bands that were trying to spiral out of that and do different other things with girl group dynamics, like Bewitched, for example, that were completely spiraling out of all those conventions and just making straight ahead pop music. And we're not regarding that. But in this case, if you want to just talk about a trajectory of quality, this is a pretty clear throughput where R&B within girl groups stayed true along the way and managed to continue to find relevance and evolve cleanly and successfully all throughout the 90s. So let's compare that up to boy bands. So all three groups that we talked about in our 80s imagination were all boy bands. New Kids on the Block, New Edition, and Menudo. All three of them approximately served the same purpose, to be a replacement for something akin to the Jacksons. So New Edition was an obvious one. Menudo was the Hispanic version of it, and New Kids on the Block was just a way to create the white version of New Edition. So that was basically what was happening. So the thing I'll say about boy bands at a macro level before we really get going, which you may or may not know or remember, is that the story of boy bands in the 90s is that, leaving aside New Kids on the Block, was a process of aggressive gentrification over a very short period of time. This is to say that where at the beginning it started with the black culture side and the white culture side going back and forth with one another, trying to jockey for position in order to find supremacy, and at the same time New Jack Swing was influencing the black culture side, it was very contentious at the very beginning of the 90s. And by the end of the 90s, the victor had become clear. So what do we mean by that? So to start off with, in 1990, we're going to start with Poison by Belle Biv DeVoe on their album Poison. This is New Jack Swing to a certain extent. It's also got New Kids on the Block elements to it, but it is very firmly a boy band idea, and it's a very classic boy band trope, which is that you shouldn't trust these girls because they're really bad for you, are just a pure soul and you just want a relationship and you want to get together and you might even want to make out with them, have sex, whatever. But at the end of the day, she's crazy. So you don't want to get with her because she's totally crazy, or in this case, she's poison. So pretty classic idea for boy bands that basically paints the picture of the infallible, in some cases, pure soul that is the singer in the boy band or the whole group of them. And the women are the ones that are causing them to change their hearts or change their perspective or whatever. So it's definitely very much within the boy band trope. And it's a really great example because it's a good bridge into what we consider to be much more formalized 90s boy band music. Because this is more of a proto example where we're still kind of running off from New Kids on the Block ideas, and Poison by Belle Biv DeVoe is starting something, but it's not something that's fully realized just yet. Even though it's 1990, it still very much sounds like it is in the 80s. Like, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that would say, Poison came out in 1990? That's surprising. I thought it came out in 1987 or whatever. And the answer is nope, 1990. So it's a good proto example. So next, let's talk about the actual start of 90s boy bandom, which is Boyz II Men, which is totally unsurprising, with their track End of the Road on Cooley High Harmony. We talked about Cooley High Harmony in our 1991 episode, so if you want to go back and listen to everything that I said about Boyz II Men in that moment, feel free to do so. So End of the Road had all of those really great harmonies that is a signature for most boy band music, because so much of boy band music, regardless of whether or not it's white culture or black culture, really leaned heavy in harmonies. And that's what the bread and butter of boy bands was all throughout the 90s. And in many respects is carried forward through until this current day, in particular with K-pop boy bands. So it's very much a thing. There wasn't any rapping necessarily on End of the Road, which is why it's at the very beginning of our boy band story for the 90s. But I would say that we're on the way. There's New Jack Swing all over this track. It's very prevalent. It's very present. You can hear some of the markers connecting it back to Poison just a year prior, but it sounds far more put together as a boy band idea now than it did a year ago, where again, it sounded more like a runoff from the 80s. This firmly sounds like it's more 1990s. So next, we're moving to 1994 with Tasty by Low Key on Back to the House. So Tasty by Low Key is very interesting because I wouldn't say that outside of the R&B sphere, there's a lot of pop culture know-it-alls that are familiar with Low Key, but this track, first of all, is amazing. It's one of my favorite tracks from that year, even though we didn't talk about Low Key in the 94 episode. And it does so many different things. It takes ideas from End of the Road, certainly the harmony part, because this is very clearly boy band music, and goes so much further with it. Basically, it took a lot of ideas from what Poison was doing, and a lot of ideas from what End of the Road was doing. They added a little bit of that fifth wave of neo-solo R&B flavor to it, so a little bit stronger beats and bass lines, both on the women's neo-solo side and the men's side. So this definitely sounds more like you're gathering up a group of men's solo R&B artists from the very beginning of the 90s. Like if you took a bunch of R. Kellys and put them together, for example, but only in a very tasteful way. And they just create this greatness here where it just sounds like End of the Road, but there's just so much more to it. Where End of the Road, by comparison, just kind of sounds like they're hanging out and doing barbershop. This sounds like it's a whole entire idea behind it. It's very well produced. It's very complex compared to End of the Road, and certainly Poison, where Poison sounds like it's operating on just one small level and End of the Road is maybe 2 or 3 levels. Tasty sounds like it's about 6 levels. Like there's a lot going on there. So that's why there is that step between 1991 and 94 before we really unfortunately start to get to the more gentrified side of things, which happens approximately in 1996 when Backstreet Boys comes out with their album Backstreet Boys, and the track is Everybody, or Backstreet's Back. The interesting thing about Backstreet Boys, which people may or may not give them enough credit for, is that they really seemed to, in their music composition and their harmonies, to bridge that gap between being accessible to Black culture and white culture. I am absolutely certain that there is a wide contingent of Black culture that perceives that the Backstreet Boys were totally co-opting the idea of boy bands in their early 90s, late 80s form. But Backstreet Boys, I perceive, did a pretty good job of having one foot in either side so that you're creating wide accessibility where you are getting those harmonies from the original ideas of R&B, and you're obviously getting the dance side or the really punchy side of Poison or Tasty by Low Key or Bill Biv DeVoe. And you're obviously hearkening back to New Kids on the Block ideas. There's a reason the Backstreet Boys became so popular as they were, and not just because of the marketing. It's because they were able to wrap so many of these historic ideas around boy bands into one package. And Everybody, or Backstreet's Back by the Backstreet Boys, is a really good example of that because it absolutely has that overly manufactured drum kit idea that is extremely characteristic of basically white-driven pop music at the time. Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, 98 Degrees, or even artists like Britney Spears or Christina Aguilera. Like all of those ideas, they all kind of have the same drum kit ideas, the same beat lines, and the same musicality. So we're definitely in that era in this point with Everybody. The reason that we use this instead of, for example, Quit Playing Games or any of their other really popular tracks from this album is that Everybody is a little bit more forward-leaning than Tasty was. It's taking some of those ideas from Tasty and it's adding even more musicality to it, adding an even greater arena to it. So it's a little bit less, you're just listening to it on the radio, or maybe you go to a smaller venue and see Low Key, for example, or Boyz II Men. And this is like, you got every single person in the entire country showing up to a concert sort of thing. Like it's creating this hugeness to it, the big grandiosity that eventually becomes the boy band market, the boy band concept becomes this hugely massive thing that pulls in tens and tens and tens and hundreds of thousands of people to see them. And not to say that Boyz II Men didn't also draw in insane crowds as well, but the Backstreet Boys was just on a completely and utterly different level. It's just a totally different level. And one could claim that this is a little bit of Elvis coming in, where it was a lot of Black artists that were doing the rock and roll thing, and then Elvis comes in and he's white, and then all of a sudden everybody's on board with it mysteriously and magically. Like there's a possibility to that Backstreet Boys did that a little bit, and we don't necessarily want to not talk about that because it is undeniably and critically important to the entire history of at least boy bands. Because remember, whereas girl groups kind of stayed homogenous in their approach, and Spice Girls was a little bit of an artifact in there, but for the most part it stayed pretty homogenous and true to R&B conventions. The boy band idea just really started to get away from Black culture and started to move more so into white culture. And that's just sort of the trajectory that it's taken. And I'm certain that boy bands on the R&B side continued to happen, but did they necessarily hit the heights that Backstreet Boys and NSYNC and this and that hit at a macro level, no, not at this point. Not in the mid-late 90s, definitely not. So because of that, Everybody is just a really great milestone for us to experience that inflection point where we've officially walked away from the R&B ideas and as a result much more grounded in Black culture and starting to move more towards white culture ideas. Because in the process too, you can hear in Everybody that it is losing a lot of its flavor. It becomes a little bit more sterile, certainly more generalizable to a wider audience, but is it becoming more sterile and it's losing its flavor and you're just sort of wringing it out? Like the harmonies aren't nearly as deep and impactful and the bass lines are a little bit banal and just you kind of bounce to it or you kind of nod your head and say, yeah, okay, fine. This makes sense. I can see that. Yeah, but that's also in many respects kind of what regular pop music does too, right? It rings out all of those details and that depth so that you're creating a product for a wider audience. And this was the product for a wider audience. So then finally, we get to 1997, in which the gentrification has officially hit a fever pitch with Mbop by Hanson on their album Middle of Nowhere. So if you kind of look at what Bill Biv DeVoe was doing in 1990 with Poison and then Mbop, I think that the distinction is pretty clear. I don't even really think you need to hammer the point more so than just say, listen to Poison and then listen to Mbop and then go back and listen to Poison again. They're both boy bands. They're both a group doing harmonies, playing off of one another, doing the boy band thing. But has Mbop stripped out 95% of the flavor and the complexity from the music in favor of just making banal pop music? Yeah. Mbop is still very listenable, even if you can't understand 90% of what's being said on purpose. Like that's kind of the point of the song. Hanson in that regard is pretty smart in creating this pop song that purposefully you can't understand hardly any of the words because they're basically saying that it doesn't matter what the words are. As long as we've made a listenable tune, you'll buy anything. And in that regard, they're absolutely right. So it's pretty tongue in cheek, but at the same time, it's completely on the money that it doesn't matter what they do because all you have to do is look at them and they'll be put on the cover of magazines because they're three long-haired blonde kids and they've got those baby faces and at least one of them, if not more of them, have that harkening back Michael Jackson-esque like high voice for pop music in a boy band. And so you've got all those things. So it doesn't super matter what the song is about because it's not relevant. Everybody by Backstreet Boys could have been about almost anything and it wouldn't have mattered. Similarly, Mbop is about basically nothing and it doesn't matter. So again, as part of this gentrification in the boy band realm, it both became whiter as time went on, but also the depth was stripped out so much so that by 1997, the songs weren't about anything at all, period. And they sold like hotcakes. So it's an interesting trajectory, juxtaposing what girl groups did and what boy bands did, where girl groups were pretty much staying in line with what was happening with R&B at the time. Boy bands went on a totally different journey. And interestingly enough, at least when it comes to boy bands, I think that once they started to get aggressively co-opted by K-pop, and now K-pop basically runs the show with boy bands globally, they've put some of the complexity and the depth back in. Like it's boy band music at the end of the day, so it's never going to be super deep, but it definitely added some of that depth back in because clearly those producers saw an opportunity where it had gotten a little too thin and started to get away from people. And this is to say too that we ended on 1997 because not too long from now, boy bands kind of become irrelevant. Like really by the time NSYNC breaks up and Justin Timberlake starts to go his own way, who really thinks about boy bands anymore? Not too many people. So food for thought. So having said that, what did you agree with? What'd you disagree with? Did you agree with what I said about girl groups and how they essentially just took that R&B trajectory and stayed true the whole time? Or did you disagree with that? Maybe I missed a whole bunch of stuff around girl groups and I was just looking with rose-colored glasses on that one. It's totally possible. Did you agree with what I said about the gentrification and the simplification of boy band music over the course of the 90s? Maybe. I don't know that that's a very contentious point to make. Feel free to disagree with it because there are some things that I certainly missed with boy bands. I think I picked these in order to elicit the point, but we didn't talk about NSYNC. We didn't talk about 98 Degrees or similarly the ever increasing conservative Christian perspective in boy band music. I think we talked about it here a little bit where we were talking more about the pure boy band member and how women were corrupting them in some potential way. I think that there's quite a few boy bands out there that tell that story pretty frequently, and it does create this marketing or branding picture of these pure souls that are on the cover of these teen magazines that none of them have girlfriends and none of them are attached, and one of them likes lollipops and the other one likes walks on the beach and the other one likes pizza. So it creates this picture where almost anybody can fall in love and be with them. That's not necessarily the same thing as girl groups, because I think that there was a teeny tiny bit of that. Like there were some people that idolized everybody from TLC, or there was an obsession about which Spice Girl you were, or Destiny's Child. Obviously everybody liked Beyonce, but there wasn't not fandom and idolization that went along with that. But boy bands was its own thing, where there was this need, this desire to remain pure, to present oneself as pure so that you could be this icon for culture. And let's be honest, I mean, even Backstreet Boys in 1996 and then going forward, we're talking about God, we're talking about Jesus, we're talking about all this stuff. And it was very much part of the persona of being in these boy bands. I would say, interestingly enough, that might be a carryover from when it was more so part of Black culture and the harmonies and the R&B tied back to something regarding the chorus in the church. Like, is it possible that that connection point existed and then they just sort of carried that forward and then it became more a white Christian thing than a Black Christian thing? Maybe. It's possible. It's a very interesting question to ask. I think that I'd like to believe a lot of people out there that analyze girl groups and boy bands to the nth degree, and probably entire swaths of research papers about the trajectory of boy bands and Christian culture and conservative culture and how that all lined and synced up with each other. So it is not for me to go into great depth about, because this is a podcast about music history, but one that, at least without me doing any in-depth research about any of these artists beyond just listening to the music, I was able to pick up all of these things just by listening to what they were saying and what they were singing about. So, frame of reference. What did you learn? Did you learn about any of the stuff that I just talked about a second ago in a rant about Christian culture as it pertains to boy bands and yet seems to be completely absent from girl groups? That's kind of weird, isn't it? What did I miss? I'm sure I missed some stuff, because I know that in the boy band side, there was a million thousand bands to talk about. And in the girl groups, I only really highlighted these 4, but there was plenty more that we didn't necessarily talk about. Hopefully you learned something, because this is kind of a shorter episode where we just went in depth on these 2 major groups of musical history in the 1990s. So before we get going, I just want to remind that if you're interested in listening to any of the 9 songs that I referenced in today's episode across the girl groups and boy bands, feel free to check out the Essential playlist, which is linked in the description of this episode. Please make sure you join us again, because we're going to keep doing this series of episodes in the season 2 finale recap. So make sure that you join us for the next one. Make sure that you rate us and comment wherever you're listening so that more people can be brought into this conversation, listen and enjoy everything we're talking about around all of these different musical moments. Make sure you find us on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod, and subscribe so that you don't miss when we drop more of these episodes for the season 2 finale and when inevitably we start season 3 in the 2000s, because that'll be upon us before you know it. And make sure you tell everybody that you know and everybody that you don't know, because every single person that we talk about this with is another opportunity for us to connect to another idea, another perspective, another voice, another head and heart and soul on all of this stuff, so that we feel even more connected through all this music. And that's really the point at the end of the day, because I know that when it comes to girl groups and boy bands, we can get a little bit sucked into the commercialism and the branding that goes along with it. And as a result, we can get pretty cynical about what all of this music means and where it goes and how it affects us and how it affects society at large and all those things. But at the end of the day, it is just music. All of these people, even the Backstreet Boys and Hanson and NSYNC and whomever, all of them are just artists at the end of the day. All of them. All of them are artists. Some of them might be a product, but they are also at their core artists, or else they wouldn't be here playing music and singing for you and doing their thing. So let's just keep that frame of reference as we go along, because in that regard, none of the commercialism about any of this should be a barrier to you appreciating it for what it is. Like, Bop is an enjoyable song to listen to, even if one could define it as fairly banal and having no substance to it. It's still interesting and enjoyable. I mean, Hanson did a good job creating the song. I honor them for that. But the only way that you can appreciate these songs for what they are is to realize that beyond them being highly commercial and getting wrapped up in the cynicism of it all, none of this stuff is scary. It's just music. Thanks for listening.